Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Moments after we finished recording, the news came that the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. This decision, which had offered protection for women and their right to an abortion for nearly 50 years, was recognized as a kind of institution in the U.S. This is owed to the organizing and concerted effort by right-wing forces, including fascist forces, to overturn this Supreme Court decision. And what you saw, election after election, for at least the last few decades, were Democrats fundraising off the threat posed by Republicans if they were elected to power, and that they had this commitment to overturning Roe v. Wade. And we could elect Democrats and they would protect this right to an abortion. Except every time that they won and cashed in off the funds that were given to them as a result of this threat, they did nothing. They did not act, including President Barack Obama, who chose not to take action in his first year in office, even though he and the people around him understood the threat posed to a woman's right to an abortion. We now are in a very dark moment in which an illegitimate court has redefined rights, and women, millions of women who have gone to places like, let's say, anti-abortion pregnancy centers, could find their private data rifled through and used by individuals at those centers to pass that information on to the authorities. Maybe it could be used to criminalize them. We do not know where this is going to go next, but it is going to get darker and darker. And we must prepare for some kind of struggle, except if you look to Congress, if you look to the Democratic Party, there is no meaningful opposition to this. There's no block of politicians, even within the Democratic Party, who you can rely upon. And it truly shows that there is much work to be done. But as this shirt says, this comes from a campaign to raise funds for an abortion clinic. And Miriam Kaba, organizer, worked on this. And people have bought shirts for the last several weeks. Now money for this shirt is going to a center in Alabama, which is in greatly endangered and threatened now. There are over 20 states that are expected to pass laws that would just outright ban abortion entirely, or maybe a little bit less than that, but not leaving much room even for people who are raped or victims of incest or something like that. And so let this radicalize you. Let this radicalize you. And with that, we go to this week's recorded episode of Unauthorized Disclosure. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm Kevin Gosztola, joined by Rania Khalek. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin. And for those who are listening, I just want to note I'm sporting once again the sanctioned hairdo, which is just wet hair because I didn't have electricity to blow dry it.
Yeah. I think sometimes it's kind of like that look, like you just look like you've been through some like whitewater rapids action or something. And you're just coming out, and you're ready to do a radio show. You're ready to do a political radio show.
Yeah, I just like persevered through like really crazy currents, and I made it out alive. Here I am. My hair is wet, but it looks kind of good. It's like a nice wet hair look. And I feel like we're both also, like, for those who are listening, you can't see, and it actually, like, for those who are watching, you can't see either because we have the Unauthorized Disclosure logo. Well, but we're both wearing, I noticed we're both wearing like t-shirts with messages on them. Now, to be fair, I did just change my shirt because I was like, oh, as soon as I got on camera with Kevin, I was like, oh, there's like water splashes on my shirt from my wet hair. Let me go change. And this is the first thing I just like was in my face. It's a shirt that I got in Venezuela, actually. it says something anti-NATO and anti-imperialist in Spanish. And then your shirt is in English. It says, let this radicalize you. So I like that we're both wearing like political messaging on our t-shirts. It's like by accident. We didn't coordinate.
No, we did not. But I have to say that I'm wearing this message. It actually comes from this Partners in Abortion Care fundraising drive that Miriam Kaba did. That was wildly successful. They funded a new that they're going to build, which is a big deal given the attacks on abortion care in the United States. And they're going to build a new clinic in, let me make sure I get the state correct because I don't want to be wrong. Also, now there are still shirts being sold with this message that will go to a center in Alabama. I believe this one is for, I want to say Maryland. Maryland was where she did, and now, and so she's been designing these shirts that have been raising thousands upon thousands of dollars. Over $250,000 was actually raised for this abortion clinic, which is just very cool. Again, something positive to open the show with. We don't normally have that kind of upbeat energy to start our show, but we do this week
because we're a very depressed show. We like to start our show with apocalyptic, depressive.
Yeah, we do a pretty bad job of like giving people a reason to watch, because like
wake up in the morning.
They'll see the headline. Like last week was not an upper of a show. You see that, the UK is allowing the US to extradite a journalist for trial, and then you go, oh well, this one's just not going to be anything to bring me out of my doldrums. And but also we need to mention that in Colombia they elected their first leftist president. I mean, it isn't that they elected. Yeah, it is. It isn't that they elected a leftist president. It's that they elected the first leftist president.
Yeah. So for like everyone who watched that happen and watched the reaction to it, the reason it was such an excited reaction or a very upset reaction, depending on like who you talk to. If you talk to your white Colombian millionaire neighbor in Miami, they were probably pretty upset. But yeah, Max Boot was pretty upset. But no, I mean, this is a really big deal because Colombia, it has always had like a right-wing government that's been so closely aligned with the US. Colombia also has like 9 US military bases and has really been the launching pad in the region for US attacks across the region against other leftist countries, especially Venezuela, which neighbors Colombia. So this is a really big deal because now you have this leftist ticket that was elected, Gustavo Petro, and also the vice president, Francia Marquez. She's the first Black female vice president ever, which is very exciting, but also she represents the Afro-Colombian community in Venezuela. So people are really excited about that. But moreover, it's their politics that matter. Colombia has a very right-wing government, or has had a very right-wing government, very much in the similar to the US in the sense of like everything's privatized, including education and healthcare. And there's very wealthy elites that don't pay taxes and control the country. Does that sound familiar to you? It should, because that's much of how, the way that America's run. And so you have these people, these aren't like hardcore leftists. This isn't like in the same sort of Chavismo sense of leftism or Cuban sense of leftism, but it's really important what they're proposing. They're talking about taxing the rich, funding social programs, and most importantly, they're talking about normalizing. They've already said we are normalizing relations with Venezuela. There's actually been a almost like small scale war on the border between Venezuela and Colombia for the past couple of years, which the Venezuelans blame on the Americans for pushing, which is these paramilitary sort of drug trafficking groups from Colombia launching attacks on the Venezuelan border. And hopefully we'll see like that start to end. And also, of course, the use of Colombia against Venezuela start to end since they're normalizing relations. And you have Gustavo Petro recognizing the government of Nicolas Maduro, which doesn't sound like it should be a big deal because he is the officially recognized president of Venezuela on the international stage. But as everybody who listens to our program knows, the US a few years ago tried to install Juan Guaido as president, continues to recognize him as the legitimate president of Venezuela, even though he was never elected. Venezuelans actually hate him, including opposition Venezuelans, by the way, because he's been such a failure. So, anyways, it's a very, very
We just
big
saw
deal.
the infamous video where he had his shirt ripped and he was thrown out of the
Right.
of this like restaurant establishment, I think.
And then of course, like Anthony Blinken was like, we condemn this attack on Juan Guaido by Chavistas, and it's like, okay, it was just like regular Venezuelans who hate him for the correct reasons. But anyways, all that said, this is a very exciting moment across, Colombia, across Latin America, for what it means in terms of like people's movements, because these aren't just two individuals who took power and won because they're popular. They had movements behind them. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on Colombia. I'm not. There's a lot of people who can speak much more specifically and in detail on these issues than I can. But we should all recognize how important this is and what it means for anti-imperialism across the region. I'm not saying, imperialism is over in Latin America, but when the country that hosts the most military bases and has been a launching pad for U.S. Operations against adversaries across the region, this is a very big deal that this particular ticket was elected. And I think it also speaks to sort of like what we're seeing across Latin America with this, as they call it, the new pink tide. We saw, sort of the same kind of leftist bent takeover in Honduras after years of right-wing dictatorship after the US coup in 2009. Mm-hmm. We saw something similar take place in Peru, though there's been challenges to that since then. In Chile, you have Gabriel Boric, who I'm not, going to pretend he's like a perfect leftist or anything, but certainly far better than the right-wingers who've been in charge in Chile for a very, very long time. So this is very important what's taking place. And I think it's something definitely to celebrate, especially when we have very few things to celebrate these days. So yay, Colombia.
Yeah. And it's owed to the presence of movements and the fact that people there are organizing. And you look at the actions that unfold, and I can't help but be envious because I wish we had that kind of energy here in the US that could bind people together. But we do have some form of protest. There is some dissent, and occasionally people do make a dent in a way that makes people in power and lobbying groups uncomfortable, which is why we've seen these laws that have been passed in southern states against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And I'd like to discuss for just a little bit on our show the fact that the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against the Arkansas Times. So this is a weekly newspaper, and on principle, this is different. We'll get back to the decision, but essentially the Arkansas Times challenged a law that was passed in Arkansas that says you have to sign an oath that you won't boycott or divest or be part of this BDS movement. And if you were found to, then you'd have to accept like a 20% cut in the rate that they would normally pay you.
Wow. Holy crap. That's wild. I didn't know about that stipulation.
That's the law in Arkansas. And I think they know that they can't just outright ban you. So they aren't saying they won't do business. They're just saying there'll be a penalty, I suppose. But I don't think it really makes much difference because you're still saying that there's a certain amount of conduct that you can't engage in. So then this becomes a First Amendment issue. And we hear a lot about First Amendment issues when people get upset about cancel culture on the right wing, but they don't usually seem to care too much about these cases. And so here, the newspaper just outright said on principle. They said, and you can say this is negative because maybe you think they should speak out on Israeli occupation, but also just on principle, they said, we as a newspaper refuse to sign any sort of oaths that say we can't engage in any kind of particular conduct, and so we're not going to do it. And then they sued because they lost a contract.
Mm-hmm.
And so they won first at the district level. It's worth noting that multiple places have won, multiple states have actually beaten back these laws in federal courts. We've seen it happen in Arizona, Kansas, Texas, and Georgia. Georgia is well known to both of us, Rania, because that's where Abby Martin won her
Yeah.
case when
Right.
she was forced to sign a loyalty oath. And so now we have this, and this decision is I think something that people should be pretty alarmed over, because if you think about the way in which boycotts can be a useful tool in protest and what it might be worth a worthwhile tactic going forward, especially as we know that capitalism stands in the way of any action around climate catastrophes, and doing anything meaningful where you're going to want to maybe challenge the oil and gas industry or challenge other industries that are big contributors to emissions. Well, this is saying essentially that the conduct that the Arkansas Times wanted to engage in was not protected by the First Amendment because it is, quote, unexpressive commercial conduct, which
Jeez, what does
which
that
is
even?
it just sounds like a made up Ministry
It
of Truth
is.
term to
Yeah.
say that you are actually not. So basically, they're saying that it is not protected by the First Amendment to tell people, like not to buy something,
That's
or
crazy.
or to just say that you're gonna, or like business decisions are not First Amendment. But also, I noticed that they mentioned a prior case. I'm vaguely familiar with this when it happened, but there was this law school, or maybe a few law schools, that had banned military recruiters. I think this was in the 2000s, and uh, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we have to remember, was still on the books, and
Yeah.
so they prohibited military recruiters. They didn't want military recruitment on their campus, and the Iraq War was happening. I think this was also part of why we saw bans against military recruiters, and that they ended up being prohibited from considering this First Amendment conduct because a court ruled that basically a neutral observer would never be able to understand that they were expressing an idea, which sounds very ludicrous to me. Like, how can you not know when the law school doesn't want military on their campus what exactly
Yeah.
that's about? But they came to this conclusion that people would have no way of knowing like what the statement was that they were making by excluding the military. And so because there wasn't speech accompanied with the decision to ban the military, that was not covered by the First Amendment. And that's where this court took its decision, a large part of its decision, and said that the law from Arkansas only prohibits economic decisions that discriminate against Israel, because these commercial decisions are invisible to observers unless explained. They're not inherently expressive and do not implicate the First Amendment. Again, it just
Yeah.
sounds like a bunch of weasel words that make it
Zero sense.
so you can protect what the Israel lobby is doing in
Right.
US states.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense what you just described. And it does sound like something completely made up. And I feel like that could definitely be challenged in court further. Like,
Yeah.
I assume it's going to be appealed, right?
Yeah, well, and it's considered an outlier decision because, as I just mentioned, a bunch of other states have said you can't do this, but they did get fortunate. These trustees at an Arkansas university who were sued, they got fortunate because they have a Trump appointee. And I just want to say, I've got this up here. I've got the statement, some of what the Arkansas Times published, and they make it clear, though maybe us who are supporters of BDS would like them to be more bold, but they do say, you know, we don't have a position on the Israel boycott movement, and we've never written on the topic. I don't know if that's a positive, but let's keep going. We simply refuse on principle to sign the pledge. But then they go on to mention that compelled speech as a condition of doing normal business with the state couldn't be more antithetical to the First Amendment, no matter what the Republican judges on the Eighth Circuit might think. And then they say that Donald Kobes, the judge who wrote the opinion, is a Trump appointee who was rated unqualified by the American Bar Association when he was nominated. He is also a former general counsel for Senator Mike Rounds, who was a co-sponsor of the federal anti-BDS law. And Kobes also apparently thinks the Boston Tea Party was not speech, but an economic activity.
Okay. All right, then.
I mean, he didn't actually say that in his decision, but I guess they're saying that because in the decision at no point does he recognize that there is this part of our history where revolutionaries threw tea into the water just as a protest to say that they're not going to pay taxes and all kinds of other stuff. That I guess that would be banned today by these Trump judges that have been put on the courts to serve Israel.
I mean, no, this right wing, it's not just the Israel stuff too. I mean, the courts are just it's, you know, you always have the US complaining about corrupt judiciaries in countries they don't like. But seriously, the American judiciary system, the way it's been stacked with right-wing judges across the board, all the way to the very top at the Supreme Court, is so scary and just speaks to like how fucked up our country is. Because there is like so much dark money going into this. Like, it's not just that Trump got elected and he was smart enough to think, let me put all these people in charge. It's that Republicans and their donors specifically have invested all this money that is so hard to trace through these like 501c4s or whatever I don't know if I'm saying that
you
right.
Got it.
Right. Like, they put all this that you can't trace. Like, you don't know who is donating to these organizations with names like Judicial Watch. I'm making that up, but it's like pretty close to what a lot of these like right-wing groups are called, that end up basically like they're just right-wing groups that get a ton of money from really rich right-wingers. We don't know who they are, to push for basically giving a list of people they want to be judges who will make decisions on behalf of the elites, of right-wing elites specifically, whether it's on abortion or whether it's on these free speech issues related to Israel, whether it's on issues related to like corporations having more rights than workers, and all these kinds of things that we're seeing like the outcome of that now, especially as we see, you know, not just what you're talking about at the state level, but especially as we see the U.S. Supreme Court coming out with these decisions in the last couple of weeks, and they're going to come out with more decisions before the court adjourns or whatever for like its break. And eventually that decision is going to be about, you know, overturning Roe v. Wade, and we know how that's going to go already. But the point is, money has been invested in this. Like, the majority of the American population is not on board with this stuff, which shows you that we're not a democracy, by the way. Like, we're not a democracy, because if you took the case that you just spoke about to the majority, to poll Americans, the majority would be for free speech if it was framed in that way, not for, you know, prioritizing Israel above, or supporting Israel above the rights of free speech, because Americans love free speech. So like, it's not just on the issue of free speech, and all these other issues, whether it's like, you know, gun regulations.
Yeah, that was a big deal this past week. Yeah. Right,
exactly. Which the Supreme Court came out and basically said that states like can't restrict as a concealed carry. I'm not, but yeah, that literally will, I guess, I don't know, I'm not sure how it works. Well, I assume that will extend to other states as well. No?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's like basically depriving states of the power to make gun control laws.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really concerning, because these decisions aren't coming because they're based necessarily in like legal theory. It's because they're, you know, these are people who are representing big money interests that have been stacked in the courts. And that is, you know, really bad for everybody living in America, because it basically means we have no say over like you have these courts stacked with right wingers who are representing millionaires and billionaires on the right, who are overturning like the kinds of laws that people that we are voting for to be in office are passing. Because that's what the judiciary does. It has the right to overturn laws that are passed by the people that we vote to represent us. So anyways, it's like a whole, very concerning big issue. And the fact that we can't even like find out who's actually funding this shit is so crazy.
Yeah. And then the fact that there'll be dissenting opinions that get written, which are just so obvious. Like they've so clearly exposed that the court has been bought and is working for special interests. I'll use that in a vague way just to mean that there could be all sorts of different groups,
whatever lobbying groups,
whatever is behind this, whether it's the
money.
NRA or whether it would be AIPAC or whatever it might be.
Because that happened, Christian fundamentalist pro like life group or whatever.
Yeah, because that happened in this case, and they're just like, look, this court didn't even look at the intention of legislators who passed the law to figure out like what they're doing, because it's so obvious that the only reason you would need a law to criminalize BDS actions
for Israel
would be to protect the Israeli government. Like, obviously, that's what you don't want to happen. All right, so I think this is where we say goodbye and thank you to all of our people who have been watching this. We're going to do 25 more minutes with our patrons. But if you want to be a patron of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast and help us keep going, we've been doing this for like 9 years. It's been really fun.
Holy crap, I feel old. 9 years sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
And I should also mention to people, I actually want to have you on at some point. No, I'm supposed to. I just should mention to people, I do have a program, the Rania Khalek show on Callin, which you should come check out. Download the Callin app. At some point, Kevin, you should come on and we can like recreate Unauthorized Disclosure on my Callin show. It's more informal, if you can believe it. It's more informal than this show, and it's basically very Q&A.
I've done a few, and I always appreciate being able to hear from people. So at some point, I expect that I'll launch my own little informal call in, and I might even do it with my colleague over at Shadowproof, where we can tackle some criminal and injustice issues.
Yeah, you should. And you've gotten several shout outs from the audience that listens to me on Callin a few times, but I keep forgetting to tell you about. People are always like, say hi to Kevin, and we love Kevin. So just so you know.
Well, that's great. I love everyone out there, and so if you do have a few dollars to throw our way per month, this gets you all the exclusive content that you're doing and helps us with a little additional source of income so that we can do the independent journalism that we do, whether it's for Breakthrough News or I have the Dissenter newsletter. And then this is rockfin.com/unauthorized an alternative if you don't want to go the Patreon route. And then, of course, that gets you access to some other shows that are posted to that video platform. So with that, we'll just keep going.
Yeah. So
all right. So
what do you got? Now let's get into it, Kevin. Let's really get into it.